Welcome to the Regulators Financial Toolbox on Communication Networks for DER integration. This is a program of the Anterix Center for Partnerships and Innovation. We can go to the next slide. The NARIC is the organization for the 50 state and territory commissions for regulating public utility services. We regulate electricity, or our members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. The CPI team is a grant funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance, and we develop resources, build relationships, and deliver trainings. And we also thank the U.S. Department of Energy for its support in today's session. We can go to the next slide. And this slide describes the Toolbox series, which is where we are trying to identify what emerging technologies are out there, how they apply to utilities, and what regulatory options our members have for addressing these emerging technologies and perhaps challenges along the way. This is the third in the series. Our next one is on resilience technologies on August 25th. So please join our listserv to find more information about how to register, or go to the evaluation and rate making section of our website for the registration link. We can go to the next slide. Today we have four esteemed panelists that I'm very excited to have. And we also have the moderator, Commissioner Gladys Brown-Dutrieuille from the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission on to moderate today's session. I'm very excited to have her as well. She is also the chair of the Critical Infrastructure Committee for NARIC. So really interested to hear what her perspective is on this topic. And with that, I will actually turn it over to her. And like I said, we will post we have the slides posted already, but then we will post the recording from today's session on the valuation and rate making section, and a written summary will also become available. So accompanying this webinar will be about 12-page summary to help regulators address this topic of communication network for DER integration. So with that, we can go to the next slide and introduce Chairman Gladys Brown-Dutrieuille of the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission as today's moderator. Commissioner?
Well, thank you very much, Carrie, and welcome everyone to today's panel. I am excited, and Carrie has given you my background, so I don't need to include that. But just to reiterate what she has said, our panel today is entitled Regulators Financial Toolbox, Communication Networks for DER Integration. So by way of background on this, the Department of Energy sponsored this panel, the Regulators Financial Toolbox, and it's designed to help regulators understand a technology and how it's treated as an asset by an investor-owned utility. So with today's Communication Networks Toolbox webinar, regulators will hear multiple perspectives on how communication networks actually work and what's unique about the distribution system and grid edge communications vis-a-vis the distribution system and bulk power system communications. They will also hear what the benefits are to the electric system, and considerations specifically for regulators. So like many things, the perfect communication solution will be up to the jurisdiction, to the commission. But this webinar will provide a framework for many decisions and help regulators to be prepared to engage with utilities on this very thorny issue. So you have also heard who our panelists are today. So I think these four individuals will bring a great perspective to this issue, and we are looking forward to a very robust and exciting conversation on this topic. I will say that in order of the presenters today, we will have Paul Martini from Newport Consulting Group, Andrew Bordine from Anterix, and Wendell Weimer representing Xcel Energy, and finishing at the end will be Jonathan Shragg, who is outlining the Tasnic Advisory Services LLC viewpoint. So I do welcome you, gentlemen. I will say before we get started today, just to bring Pennsylvania's viewpoint in, since Carrie did mention that I was the chair of Pennsylvania's Public Utility Commission. I don't believe we have any docketed proceedings on cloud computing, But we have had some case precedent in rate cases where we permitted capitalization of cloud computing costs. So this rate making decision is consistent with previous NARUC resolution, a resolution that was passed in November of 2019 at our annual conference. And the information landscape is constantly evolving. We know this. So with this ever-changing progression comes a duty of regulators to keep up with the demand of the educated consumer base. So as consumers, we're faced with the challenge of how to construct a regulatory climate which accommodates new technologies and capabilities in order to provide utilities with the tools necessary to satisfy and empower customers. And permitting the capitalization of things like cloud computing helps to align the interest of regulated utilities with expectation of the 21st century consumers. So, but we still have that responsibility as commissioners to maintain our steadfast obligation to ensure all costs embedded in rates, regardless of accounting treatment, are prudent. And we definitely struggle with that, trying to find that fine balance all the time. So as I stated before, we have a great group of presenters, and I do want to turn it over to our first presenter. Before I do, let me remind everyone that I as the moderator will have a question for each of the presenters right after their presentation. And then we will have an opportunity for individuals to ask questions through our Q&A feature. So make sure you put your questions in there, whether it's directly right after the presenter or at the end. We have provided for a considerable time period to ask questions as well at the end. So our first presenter is Paul, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that we'll be talking about today is how telecommunication networks for a modern grid really support a number of critical public policy and customer and operational purposes. And based on the work that I was involved in with the Department of Energy's modern distribution grid report, the DSPX project that we conducted over the last 5 years now. One of the things that we identified pretty early on was a very objective-based process for identifying investments, being able to understand the interrelationship between various investments on the grid, and in particular, then how do you think about prioritizing and sequencing those investments? One of the things that I'll be touching on here over the next couple of slides is really how telecommunications, as we think about in the grid, really provide one of the key foundational elements to support a broad range of objectives, from safety and operational efficiency, reliability and resilience, and DER integration and utilization, which is obviously a key component of today's conversation. And that spans a number of sort of capabilities and functions that support market operations. That is the use of distributed resources to support non-wires alternatives, as well as participation in markets, obviously grid operations, and also information related to supporting the planning process, as we've been discussing through many of the NARUC workshops, NARUC and NASIO workshops. Next slide, please. So one of the things as we talk about telecommunications, it's important to really understand that we're really kind of thinking about 3 dimensions. That is the wide area network, or WAN as it's sometimes referred to, which is really covers from the back office out to the substation. This is generally fiber optic or some other landline communication, or possibly some form of wireless communication. Microwave has traditionally been used, increasingly being substitute with fiber optic. We have a field area network that covers, say, from the substation out to devices in the field, and then a neighborhood area network that may cover the last bit, often associated with the advanced meter infrastructure. Sometimes the field area network goes out to the edge, to the meter, and there's some options there that others will talk about. But fundamentally, what we're seeing that is different now than where we've been historically is that these are no longer single purpose networks, but rather, kind of borrowing a term from the telecommunication industry, we're really looking at converged networks. That is, the uses of these systems are increasingly multi-use. That is, we're looking at how to leverage this infrastructure to support multiple uses, from customer service, say with metering, to grid operations, to the use of distributed resources and teleprotection systems. So we're really looking at multiple ways of thinking about utilizing these assets, these telecommunication networks, to really support multiple uses. And we're really understanding how to leverage from the edge all the way back up to the substation and then back into the back office for various operational and customer support systems. So not only do we think multiple purposes, but rather how do we think about this network as a holistic, integrated system? And that's quite different than where we've been historically. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned at the outset, for these reasons, we've really kind of delved in deeper, and there's much more behind this, as you can imagine, in the 4-volume series we developed in conjunction with NARUC and many states in particular, developing this modern distribution grid series. And the 4th volume, the guidebook, came out a couple of years ago. And there's more depth associated with why we make the case that operational communications of the type we're talking about here are really a core component that support multiple applications within the utility that provide and support the objectives, both policy, customer, and obviously some of the requirements that the utility needs to perform to. And also, third-party applications, in particular, the use of distributed energy resources. So it's really a foundational element. Next slide, please. But as we think about communications, another question that seems to arise, and it's certainly one that we've heard as part of the DSPX effort over the past few years, is really, when is it the right time to be thinking about adopting technologies? Because obviously technologies evolve, and we continue to see innovations, and that is certainly the case with utility-based communications. We've certainly seen a lot in the field area and what I referred to as the neighborhood area communications, and we'll hear more about that today. And the uses, as I mentioned, have been expanding. So how do we think about when is the right time, and what should we be thinking about in terms of the life cycle of these technologies? And obviously, from a physical standpoint or a technical standpoint, the lifespan could be quite long, as we've seen with many of the existing communications that a utility may have that have been around for, in some cases, 30 years or more. But often what really drives it is the functional obsolescence. So when is that technology really functionally not able to support the range of uses or applications that may be required for what we're trying to achieve through the grid, particularly as we think about distributed resources or managing EV charging or other applications, as we think about more resilient grid operations. How do we need to think about what the capabilities of that system to require? And I'm sure, as you're going to talk about in a follow-on session with respect to AMI, and I believe Jonathan has experience in this as well, thinking about these timing between when you think from one technology to the next, and what life cycle from a depreciation standpoint you might consider is appropriate, and what you may need to think about in terms of the design of the system to allow some flexibility over time, as you may need to evolve to take advantage of advances in later innovations over a time horizon. As suggested here, what we've kind of been seeing, let's say in the AMI space with the neighborhood area networks, we've largely seen a 15-year cycle in technology capabilities, as represented by these sort of classic technology S-curves. That's what's represented here. And what you see is that, from an AMR starting back in the late 80s and 90s, we saw a transition to what we started to implement in AMI in the late 2000s into the to today. And then over the past 5 years, we've seen a next generation of communications starting to be introduced by the technology providers based on both what technologically was possible as well as the expanded uses of the system. So you see that we have this sort of stair step that happens over time that we think in terms of capability and functionality, and how we think about these transitions and how we design that into both the technology roadmaps as part of investments, but also how to think about when is the right time to be adopting. And because there are challenges that can arise if you adopt late and then sort of get stuck with respect to what that capability is, as you may then start looking further down the road that you want something more sophisticated to be able to handle a broader range of functionality. Next slide, please. Another thing to kind of think about with respect to the value that a telecommunication network and how that relates to other investments in the grid. Telecommunications in the grid really, the value creation operates very much like what we see with respect to Metcalfe's law that you may be quite familiar with in sort of commercial telecommunications. Certainly mobile communications, but the internet more broadly. That is, Metcalfe's law says that for every there's a square of value for every added connection, and it's not quite that here. But the point is that we do get this exponential growth in value, because really what we're talking about with grid networks is the same phenomena. We're connecting more devices increasingly to that network, more systems on the back end from planning and operations and other markets to be able to leverage and interact with those devices. And as a result, you get a similar sort of phenomenon that you get this exponential value in relation to a classic investment curve as represented there in the dark blue, where you have this initial rise in investment, but then incrementally the investment tapers off because you're just adding, incrementally, fewer nodes out in the field, if you will, in terms of expenditure, because a lot of the back office expenses is relatively fixed and can scale to address more devices out in the field. So you get this kind of phenomenon that's represented here conceptually. There is a bit of a lag, as you can imagine, because you have to build out the communication network and then connect the devices typically. So there's a slight lag, but it's not a significant lag. The other is, which is often a question that arises, is telecommunication investments are inherently proportional to the value creation because they're largely linked to when you're going to deploy devices that need the telecommunications in a particular part of a service area. So, and that tends to follow when there's value, when it's cost effective to put those devices. So if we're talking about intelligent field switches on a distribution circuit, or putting expanded SCADA capabilities at a substation, or providing some sensing out in the field, or adding integrated volt-VAR controls to manage voltage when we have greater numbers of distributed resources. Obviously, the advanced meter infrastructure, advanced metering. So this is all proportional as we look at the investments here. Next slide, please. The other is, in the guidebook that we developed, which is the cover here that's shown, we did address a way to think about economic valuation for investments, in particular, how, where telecommunications would fit. Next slide, please. And here, what we showed, and there's much more discussion, obviously, in the guidebook, but basically, telecommunications really fits in this joint and interdependent benefit category, as well as supporting standards compliance and policy mandates. So it tends to fit in what we called the core components, as I mentioned earlier. And as a result, what we outline in some depth is a rationale for why we believe that a least cost best fit approach makes most sense here. And there's some examples of of at least one state that we identified in the guidebook that had gone through a process to really think through this and their conclusion in an order that they provided. So this is something that we've outlined, and I would recommend that you take a look at that section, that chapter actually in the guidebook for more details. But this is how we arrived at where we thought telecommunications, amongst other core components, would fit in terms of an evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And let me say that we have a lot of people that are very interested. They focus in on the same thing I focused in when I was hearing your presentation, and you talked about when was the appropriate time for this technology. So one of the questions that we received in the chat feature specifically for you, or it was the question and answer feature, excuse me. Trying to find it. I was doing very well. Oh, here we go. So how does the regulator identify when this transition is needed or otherwise plan for obsolescence? How are these costs best addressed to minimize stranded costs? And I was thinking about it as well, because, we're talking about even AMI, different states, different times have addressed that. Ours in Pennsylvania, we've addressed it statutorily and required that smart meters be installed over a certain period of time. And we've had different companies that were already moving towards it and some that had not started. And so because the technology was also evolving very quickly, depending on when they started to install them, they probably have an older technology, and as things started to advance very quickly, they probably wanted to upgrade them. So I'm throwing that all at you, Paul.
Yeah, well, there's a couple ways to think about this, and it starts really with having both the vendor, if you will, in the conversation with the utility, to really understand their technology roadmap. So where are they taking their technology over time? Generally, those would be 5-year outlooks, but even more broadly, where do they see the research and development taking things beyond? And much of what they do in product development is based on what utilities have identified as the uses of the system and what they require of telecommunications. So, going back to integrated distribution planning with a 10-year outlook, which is something we recommend as part of the DSPX effort, that it's that helps you really think through where you may need to go in terms of the capabilities that you need to communicate with the vendor community. In turn, that really needs to be communicated with the commission when you make the argument for what investment you're planning to make, is both why are you picking the technology that you're selecting, as well as how are you, what we often refer to as future proofing in terms of the way that you architect the system, because there are options around how you think about some modularity of the communication so that you're not so tightly coupled to, say, an edge device that would mean that you'd have to completely change everything. So there's some limits to that, obviously, but in the AMI case, there's ways to think about structuring the system in a way that you kind of can reduce some of that sort of functional obsolescence issue in the way that you design the system. And that's something that you'd want to be having a conversation with the with the utility as they present their case, and something you'd want them to be able to articulate with you. And we discussed this quite a bit in the DSPX materials. I'm sure others here will touch on it as well. The other thing is some utilities have taken the step, and this is certainly from my past experience, is because of this phenomenon that we saw, we actually asked for a shorter depreciation cycle on telecommunications than we thought we might otherwise do. From a technical obsolescence, if you will, we kind of looked at the functional obsolescence and said, well, we actually think it's about half of what the technical is. So if the technical was 15 years and we think that the functional may be only, let's say, 8, we actually, requested 8-year depreciation on some of the telecommunication components because we thought we might have to replace some of them sooner. Not the meters themselves, but other components in the network as part of that. And that actually turned out, to be true as we saw some of the evolution over the last decade. So there's some options there to think about how to balance these risks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And we will hope that you stay on the line because we will have questions at the end, additional questions or opportunities for questions at the end. So now our next presenter is Andrew Bordine, who is from Excel.
Anterix.
Anterix, I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you, Andrew.
No problem. Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. I'm very excited to be here to have a chance to chat with you guys today. And as we get into the slides here, and before we get into the content, I wanted to start with, how do we get to the point where communications and networks are so important? What's really driving this, I guess, for the industry? And, you can look at grid modernization investments. They're continuing to increase. Everybody's seeing that, right? And much of the value that's coming from these investments is through interpreting the data that's coming back. So whether it's for control, optimization, system resiliency, these are all important parts of any utility grid today. And what we find is those communication networks that are enabling the transportation of that critical data now becomes a key foundational element, if you will, to a utility's strategy. So it's kind of where we find ourselves today, I think, as we're looking into these systems. I spent the early part of my career designing utility distribution systems, and that has changed, drastically over time. And I remember as a young engineer designing systems where the communication component was a small black box on a diagram, right? It was almost an afterthought, really, for me. And it was something, the IT organization would figure out. And that was common practice at the time. But what you're seeing now is that that one-off approach has led to many utilities now having to handle and deal with a multitude of legacy systems that need an overhaul, number one, but also are trying to meet, today's changing environment. One utility that we're working with talked to us, and they were sharing how they have about 19 different networks that they desperately need to consolidate and do a handful, maybe 4 or 5. And you can think about it from utilities perspective, the savings alone, right? Not only in the maintenance of those networks, but in the people that it takes to operate those on a day-to-day basis can be reduced. And so there's a big incentive for them to really look at these systems and start biting a little bit of it off to say, is this something that we want to pursue as a utility in terms of looking at that? So a great example today, obviously, and the focus of this webinar being around DERs, or distributed energy resources, and kind of the critical role that we can play here. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to start with just a very easy, simple diagram to talk about where power is headed. And one of the main things around DERs is specifically around power flow for utilities. And so what's on the left is the traditional utility model, which you guys are all familiar with, around a centralized scheme. And that's basically where a generating asset is feeding all of the customers downstream, whether it's residential, businesses, industrials. And when you start looking at a distributed model, like what's shown on the right, a couple of key things come into play. Number one, you have a two-way power flow scenario. So not only are the assets capable of receiving energy from a generation facility, but many of those customers also have or can have generation that is a lot closer to them, hence distributed. And usually what that means is a business or even a residential home might have a renewable that's attached to it, solar, wind power, battery storage is becoming more prevalent now. But all of these things are items that are interacting with the grid. And, for a utility, if you think about it from their perspective, it also has an impact on their network strategy and what the utility needs to be able to see. And so real time, if you think about homeowners or businesses or third-party entities that now may be dispatching load or dispatching energy, back onto the grid. A utility needs to be able to understand that and see what impacts that it might be having. So, in the past, very simple for a utility to install fiber, right, to a generating plant, to some of the assets. But as more of those endpoints start to grow, and particularly endpoints that they may not have control over, a third-party asset, maybe it's a renewable or battery storage unit, they need a way to communicate with that. And wireless communication becomes one of the areas that's more important there. It can definitely be cheaper than fiber for some of those installations, and it may prove to be more cost-effective, specifically in rural areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so Paul hit on this a little bit, just talking through the different types of networks in the areas. The one I want to focus on today is really the FAN or the field area network. And this is, just for educational purposes, this is something that you see at most utilities, and the explosion of end devices, if you will, from a utilities perspective, this is kind of where that action is taking place. And the FAN, it's incorporating a lot of the end devices that are in a utilities toolbox, if you will, that they want to communicate with. And as they're blanketing these devices over their service territory, they can serve many different purposes. And it's also where network consolidation, like I mentioned before, can become important. So if you have a plan that requires a network for each application, it can be very burdensome. But if you have a way of looking at those different needs as a platformed approach, that can definitely be a strategy that helps utilities in that area. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a depiction here to show, where some of that growth is taking place. And it isn't just in the distribution network. It isn't just even in the electric sector. You can have natural gas entities that are a part of this. You're seeing some of it in the transmission area, as well as mobility. Fleet mobility is a big one here. So there's many endpoints. Some are wired, some are wireless, and that need for connectivity is here, not just in one area. I'd mentioned the combination of resources a little bit, but one of the interesting things for regulators to take a look at is or consider how can we combine network strategy or combine resources, especially around communications. And that is one area where we can actually avoid duplication of assets. So an example would be maybe you have a gas and electric combination utility, maybe they're separate entities. Are they able to use the network, the same network for both sides of that business? Are you able to incorporate maybe a water company, smaller municipals or co-ops that don't have access typically to some of the more expensive components? Does it give them an opportunity to kind of partake in this environment? And then one of the things that does is it can drive the end customer's cost down or help them to save, because they're not then paying for multiple networks across multiple entities. But that's something that's kind of forward-looking, like Paul mentioned, when people are looking at that 5 to 10 year time horizon, that can be one area of focus. Next slide, please. Okay, so just some quick key considerations to think about. And these are some of the things that I keep in mind when thinking about networks, future networks, and what those need to look like. And Paul had mentioned utilities, they do the best they can to try to future-proof their system. And there's some ways or things that help them down that path. So one of them is having a standards-based process and having standards for interoperability specifically. But having standards in place is really what helps kind of combat that one-off scenario that I mentioned. And it can be costly sometimes in the beginning, but it also helps to speed up the time that's needed to develop a solution. Interoperability across utility systems is a whole nother area. You see that more on the bulk power grid system where generation facilities are sharing data. So there's opportunities there, but I think even on the distribution side for utilities to work together and to share resources across systems. Flexibility and scalability is also very important. A system that has, let's say, several hundred endpoints can behave very differently from one that has millions of endpoints. So again, they're thinking about your future operability, future plans is key. There's always more units coming online. I don't think that'll ever go, in the reverse direction. So preparing for that is very important. And then enforcing cybersecurity. So I know you all watch the news. You've seen the pipeline attack recently, other key critical assets that are being targeted or have been targeted in the past. Having provisions in there on a secure approach is critical. And you can look at LTE technology, long-term evolution. That's an example where there's a security component that's kind of built into its architecture. So it gives utilities really an additional layer there of protection that they can rely on when they're building out their security plan. And kind of the last area is around keeping the grid resilient. So, when I think of the electric grid, it's definitely this living, breathing animal, if you will, that's running all day long, and it's constantly changing. And I think we're seeing that both through regulations as well as technology. And being able to keep that system operating real time and make decisions based on that will continue to be important for all utilities. So I'm excited to see kind of where that goes in the future and looking forward to be a part of it. That's all for me.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I do have a quick follow-up question for you, because I was focusing also when you were talking about the consolidation of networks and talking about the use of these networks of utilities by maybe a municipal utility or something of that nature, which would help save costs, and the end user, we know, are the ones that the consumers are the ones that will be paying for these networks. So are there other things that could be done in terms of saving or consolidating these networks?
Sure. So it's this great chance, like you mentioned, for different entities to come together on a solution, either at the local level or it could be at the national level, right? Depending on how it pans out. But what's also interesting to me is there's a number of different ways that utilities can go about sharing that network. So a recent one that I know the NARUC audience specifically is familiar with is around rural broadband. I know NARUC just passed that recent resolution on rural broadband, which was fantastic. And I look at that as a way for utilities to think about how they're upgrading their infrastructure that serves their purpose, but also can support this rural broadband initiative as an example. So in that scenario, maybe the utility is looking to upgrade their wireless network. Maybe they're installing towers within their service territory footprint. And maybe it's an opportunity for another entity, an internet service provider, to take up the charge from that point and use that same tower to then serve the public for another purpose around rural broadband. So, I think there's multiple use cases there that definitely can benefit not just the utility, not just a single entity, but kind of the whole collective that I think we can look forward to.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We may have another question for you at the end, but we do want to go on to our next presenter, who is actually from Excel. We have Wendell Reimer, who is presenting next. Wendell?
Thank you, Commissioner. As is mentioned, I'm from Excel Energy, and we operate in 8 states, which we'll talk about later, comes into play when we talk about challenges with both federal regulation, state regulation, as well as the various commissions that we have the opportunity to work with. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It just kind of gives you an idea of who we are. If you go to the next slide. I wanted to jump into basically 2 different kind of views is how we look at our OT network. And OT, by the way, stands for operational technology, and it's really the network that supports our grid. So whether it be our transmission grid, our electric distribution grid, our gas grid, we often refer to our OT network as the 4th grid. That is directly in line with what we're doing out there. And this kind of shows you a picture, a very high level one, that if you start on the right-hand side, you will see, houses, which could be small businesses as well, but it's kind of that, residential view of our customer set. And we have gone the strategy route of implementing what's called a YSUN mesh. YSUN is an alliance that is based on IEEE standards, very similar to the standards of Wi-Fi in your home and businesses. And what it allows us to do is basically blanket our operating area and where our customers are with a wireless network that has takeout points that you see in the middle there called access points. And there's some repeaters in there which extend the coverage. And we can also use that same network to connect to distribution automation, DER, batteries, you basically name it, anything that has somewhat of a medium to low bandwidth requirement and medium latency requirements, meaning latency being the time it takes to make the trip back and forth. And the dotted lines kind of represent to you, how that traffic is handled. And the vendor that we implemented this with has the capability to basically heal itself. So if one device goes down, whether it's an access point or a repeater, it heals itself, finds another path. So it's designed in such a way, the more devices you put in there, the more resilient it is, and the fewer cases we have where we create a network outage. And it's actually, we've had this in place in parts of Colorado and Minnesota for about 1.5 years now, and it's really proven itself out. We rarely have what we call a SAV1 or priority 1 incident with our network. It basically heals itself. And in this case, the meters, the sensors, all the devices you have out there actually participate as part of the network. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of how we're handling that area. Then we do what we call backhaul. We got to bring that information back into our data centers and back into the systems that you see in the upper left, whether they be our distribution management systems, our advanced meter infrastructure, customer apps, or control systems. And we have multiple ways of doing that. We prefer private, and you'll see some of the reasons for that down on the lower left side. One of it is capital versus O&M. So it's investing in our, we call it steel for fuel, where we, will rather invest in capital efforts and own that device versus paying somebody an expense. And that allows us to control our costs and be much more predictable. You've heard the term converged networks. The other part of the network structure you may hear of is IT networks. And that's, like how we connect to our offices and people do email and, things like that. We're trying to stay somewhat away from converging our IT and OT, and there's some very good reasons for that. One of them being security. And, we've heard a lot about, some of the attacks on various businesses over the last, year or so. Having the ability to completely separate our OT network logically and physically helps us in those situations to protect that environment from any outside influences. And that's actually proven out. The other thing that you've heard is multi-use networks. And I added the with QoS, that stands for quality of service, which allows us to control who has priority on that network. So in a normal blue sky operations, meters are, over that, distribution automation is out there, our fault location devices are all out there communicating just fine. But if you get into a storm mode, that's when you want, your most critical sensors and your most critical devices out there to tell us exactly what's going on, what's down, pinpointing where we can send our trucks, et cetera, et cetera. And then, resiliency and security designed in. The other thing is, we have the capability with the devices we deploy to use either public cellular, we can use private, LTE, as was just mentioned, and really that's just a SIM card switch on some of the devices, similar to your cell phones that you use. And we also have a considerable amount of private fiber that we can connect to as well. So it's really looking at what's the best situation to provide a highly reliable, highly secure solution at the most cost-effective rate for our customers. And then the upper right side, you see we're very standards-based, which was mentioned earlier as well. Next page. And then I want to flip over a little bit to give you a very high level of how I view the commercial side of our business. This is when you get into some bigger facilities. Could be large battery, could be microgrid type situations, could be solar farms, wind farms. And that is really setting a standard around how we provide connectivity, and you'll see things like site-to-site VPNs, which are a virtual private network, which allows us to encrypt and really protect that. We prefer private fiber versus lease, but we do an awful lot of lease circuits as well. And again, on the left-hand side, where we connect to a third party, and I'll talk about that in a second, having very specific standards that we follow. You'll see on the right-hand side, and I won't go through all of them. You can read them at your leisure, but really having very specific edge routers, firewalls, and gateways that really are standards-based and also very consistently based. So we have basically a cookie cutter footprint that we do for each one of these situations that allows us to deploy them much quicker. It keeps our support costs down from a run state perspective, and also troubleshooting when we know exactly what's out there and people are familiar with it. I wanted to touch briefly on the third party side, because a lot of the DER is an awful lot of partnerships with other vendors and some of the teams that they bring in, and other companies that provide third party servicing for those facilities. And it creates a unique thing, right? Because we have now third parties that aren't necessarily employees or contractors or people on our facilities gaining access to something that we are supporting from a commercial customer base. And I won't go into a lot of detail other than if you flip to the next slide, it's not even a technical challenge as much as it is how do we provide that in a secure, reliable, consistent fashion. And you'll see that rather high level view of when we need a vendor to do that. As many of you know, there's a commissioning aspect to it as well as an ongoing operational side, and normally under very tight timelines, and also low cost to make sure we get through the commissioning side. And so if you flip to the next page, this shows you that we are taking an approach with how we've designed and configured our networks for this to have a commissioning phase where the vendor can actually get in there and contractually get through the connection and get the thing up and running and make sure everything's working. And then once it's commissioned, we flip over to an operational perspective that has some of the added security and the connection to the XL network. So I ran through that fairly quickly, somewhat to help us get on board, but it kind of gives you a look at how we are looking at our networks, and particularly in the DER arena.
Thank you very much, Wendell. I have a question for you, but I will say at the end, we do have a couple of questions that popped up from our audience. So we'd like to make sure that you're with us at the end so we can ask you those questions. But I was focusing on your statements in terms of, you made a statement, we will prefer the private network. And I know that when I was doing my research in preparation for this panel, it was very interesting to see some of those concerns of private versus public. And I really would ask you to expand upon that.
Okay.
And I heard you say, the company would prefer to control the asset. And I know resiliency is very important to all of the discussion as well, but just want to give you a couple more minutes to expand upon that.
No, that's a good question. I appreciate that, Commissioner. There's really three areas that we'll look at in that. One is very quantifiable numbers, right? And that gets to the O&M versus capital. So, we keep track and measure, how much we're spending either through lease circuits or, some of the old analog lines, which are getting very expensive, and cellular costs. And those are O&M costs that directly hit, both our customers, as well as our own profitability. And so that's one area that can be measured, but rarely does that totally cost justify a private network, at least, in a single point in time. The second two that you mentioned are resiliency and security. Hard to measure the benefits, right? But particularly from a resiliency standpoint, we measure something called mean time to repair. How quick can we get something fixed when it goes down? Could be a fiber cut, could be whatever. As many of you know, particularly up in the north, when we hit the summer, we're into fiber cut season, trench season. And that has a direct impact. So building resiliency creates, alternate paths, but we've also been able to show that we can usually repair our own telecom facilities quicker than relying on our providers to do that. And that's just, the nature of the business. And then the third one that I'll talk about is the net cost of adding new devices. And it was kind of mentioned earlier, I think in Paul's presentation, that once you build that network, particularly a wireless network overseeing a residential area or a city or municipality, adding another device has a really low, if not zero, net cost to us to add those devices. So a longer term view means we can provide more and more devices at a lower cost per device.
That does answer my question. Thank you very much, Wendell. And once again, as I stated with everyone else, hope you stick around for some questions at the end.
Absolutely.
Our last presenter is Jonathan Shragg. Jonathan, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jonathan Shragg, and my background is more of a regulator than as a telecom engineer. Let me get my video started. There I am. And I'm going to take the privilege of going last to adjust a little bit my remarks to address some of the things that my colleagues have talked about on the regulatory side, and particularly two pieces. How can regulators encourage utilities, require utilities to make use of the network investments that have been made, both to benefit third parties like cities and towns for shared network services, and also for the full range of utility assets that have the potential to benefit from communications. So I'll just say a few words of introduction. We all know that there is more ubiquitous computing and communications happening, whether it's inventory management, whether it's handheld computing, whether it's automobile computing. It's pervasive, and it depends on wireless communications. For utilities, the field area network is key. The communications revolution has really been focused on how to enable resilience and to integrate the distributed energy resources we see that are proliferating on the grid. I want to focus a little bit today on advanced meter infrastructure and the need for the related data transport systems attached to most AMI proposals. And let me just say that communications networks represent a relatively small proportion of most distribution system investments. When one is thinking about an AMI proposal in the hundreds of millions of dollars, communications is often 10 or 20%. But nevertheless, the architecture of communications strongly shapes the overall trajectory of grid modernization for a utility. And I think that strategic role of communications is hugely important beyond the actual dollar cost itself. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So the new customer devices that we are all seeing put onto the system, they encounter the distribution system at the meter. And this term, the grid edge, is being bandied about. It really is where the customer side and the utility controlled side meet at the meter. And the advanced meter, which over half of Americans currently have and is proliferating, both AMR and AMI, the meters that can have embedded communications and talk with each other, as well as the ones that have a simple radio to communicate to a passing van. The advanced meter generates, millions of data points over a period of time, and carried by a range of utility-owned communication systems, pretty diverse legacy of systems. And all of that data has the potential to inform how utilities manage this new operationally complex environment of electric vehicles, electric heating, batteries, rooftop solar. What AMI presents is the opportunity to use real-time data to make operational adjustments that will ensure safe and reliable service. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, often grid edge data isn't fully utilized, right? What most utility proposals look to for data is to take millions of meters, the bits of data from millions of meters, transport them over communication systems to a data lake. And for real-time analysis, that would require enormous amounts of communications capability, and also enormous upgrades in centralized computational capacity. So most utility AMI proposals say that they cannot use AMI data for real-time grid management. Instead, the data comes back to a data lake. That lake of data is analyzed over some period of time, whether it's days or weeks or months, to create planning scenarios that are then used for the next planning cycle, rather than making real-time operational adjustments to the distribution system. Next slide, please. And so most AMI proposals are limited to conventional AMI benefits that are still quite significant: reduced truck rolls, reduced meter reader employees, better reactive management, and in jurisdictions that have adopted them, some savings related to both time of use rates and voltage optimization. And often the voltage optimization, both capacity and energy, represent the bulk of the savings from AMI 1.0, if you will. Next slide, please. But there is an AMI 2.0 that is emerging in some jurisdictions, such as New York, such as Colorado, based on higher communications capability and higher computational capability. The communications and computational capabilities embedded on each meter allow the meters not to talk back to the data lake, but rather to act as a real-time peer-to-peer network. So using advanced data analytic techniques and on-meter software, meters can react to real-time changes that they observe based on data they are receiving from their neighboring meters. That allows predictive outage management. It allows integration of DER. It allows system visualization. And the meter begins to be an asset not just for customer benefits, but for grid-facing benefits, and to potentially offset many grid modernization investments. Next slide, please. So now we come to the main challenge. The main challenge is when a commission authorizes an AMI proposal that usually includes a significant communications upgrade, how does the commission ensure that those communications investments are fully utilized? How do you make sure that the utility over some period of time, whether it is a full technical lifespan of an asset or the shorter commercial lifespan, as Paul mentioned, how does the commission make sure that over the lifespan of the asset, utilities are encouraged to fully use it in as many ways as possible? Well, New York, and then later Kentucky, and currently under consideration Connecticut, have enacted variations on something that's an interesting regulatory tool called a benefit implementation plan. And it is really quite simple. Pending, following the approval of AMI, the utility is required to work with both vendors and stakeholders and interveners in a proceeding to come up with a schedule and a plan for how the full range of benefits that have been identified in a proceeding will be realized over a 5- and 10-year period. And there are relatively specific requirements for quarterly reporting and for metrics and milestones for the development and implementation of additional benefits. That is a significant post-approval regulatory oversight that gives commissions greater control over a deployment. Often the only tool that a commission has after it has authorized a deployment would be 5 or 10 years later to say that to disallow an investment, disallow cost recovery. And that is a significant decision that most commissions are averse to taking, and most commissioners have rotated off of the commission by the time that kind of a review is mature. So the benefit implementation plan, or what's being called a BIP, is a very nice idea for achieving that kind of regulatory oversight. I think just shifting now very briefly before I conclude to the issues of shared services. For commission regulators, shared services with cities and towns offer enormous opportunities, but also a little bit of a conundrum. So if a utility has a communication system and it wants to make that communication system available not just to its gas business, but potentially to the separate water utility, so that there doesn't have to be a duplication of networks, or perhaps to a city to allow traffic light control and synchronization, or for emergency services. There would, under that construct, be some revenue that would come to the utility that owns the communication system. And the commission has to decide what to do with that revenue. Does the revenue simply offset the revenue requirement? In that case, the utility might not have any incentive or reason to engage in that activity. Is there some revenue sharing agreement that needs to be made for these alternative revenue streams? Some commissions and some utilities have experienced selling natural gas capacity on markets that allows them to keep a share of the revenue and to give a share to ratepayers. Some of those issues have been worked out, but some are quite thorny and would need to be addressed for these third-party communications partnerships to take seed. So those are the two regulatory issues I want to talk about. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I do have a follow-up question for you, especially since I got my regulator hat on. Looking at very interested in the information you provided in terms of other jurisdictions like New York and Kentucky, and then also Connecticut, considering different things. The idea of the BIP, the Benefit Implementation Plan, I was wondering with that, are those statutory requirements from those states, or is it something that is generally part of their statutory authority and they decided as they saw the need for it, that they decided to implement that through some type of regulatory process?
Sure. The New York Commission implemented it all on its own authority as a part of a compliance docket in a rate case, a national grid rate case. I think it's 17-E-0238, and I can follow up in the chat with the number. But they created 3 pages in a 50-page order that specified the milestones and the requirements for what a benefit implementation plan should be.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask the rest of our presenters to come back up on screen so that we can ask you some additional questions. We do have some in the chat feature, so I do want to follow up with that. And also just remind people, if you do have a question, please just put it in the Q&A. I keep confusing it. It's not the chat feature, it's the Q&A feature. So let me start with, this is a follow-up question, I believe, for Jonathan, but if anyone else wants to jump in. It says, for AMI 2.0, are you talking about AMI meters with distributed intelligence capabilities? We have, and then my question went off. We have been asked about this with our AMI deployment in Ohio, and I'm wondering if it is what you are referring to. That's the question.
Yeah, I think distributed intelligence in quotes is an Itron proprietary sort of brand for those capabilities. I think both Landis and Gear and Itron and Aclara all offer that same kind of capability with different software. But I think the short answer is yes. Peer-to-peer communications and on-meter computation is the key difference from what might be thought of as AMI 1.0.
Okay, if anyone else wanted to chime in on that question.
Just to clarify, Commissioner, what Jonathan referred to as AMI 2.0 is the same as what I noted on my slide with the S-curves as advanced metering and communication. So it's the same basic technology that we're talking about. In this peer-to-peer, by the way, just to add a little clarity there, AMI, the meters could not connect to each other. They could connect between the meter and a takeout point, as Wendell had referenced. In the next generation, the current generation that we're talking about, this AMI 2.0, the meters actually can hop from one meter to another. They could, although they always hopped from one to the next, they could actually communicate with the other meter, which they couldn't do in the prior generation. So that's really the distinction, is although they were hopping before, they weren't actually communicating with the other meter in terms of passing information. Now they can.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly from our perspective, whether it's distributed intelligence or edge computing, it's really bringing computing capability out to those devices out in the field, whether it's a meter, whether it's a cap bank, whether it's a recloser or whatever. And the way I would suggest, and we talk to people about it that aren't really on a technical perspective, is think of it like your iPhone. That the phone in and of itself provides the capability. It's the applications that get built that reside on those devices and how they talk to each other that really starts to add value, whether it's giving information to other devices, providing information back to your control systems, or even providing communications to the customers, and whether it be residential or commercial. Think about how fast the iPhones, and the other devices, Samsung's and other, grew over a period of 5 years. We're going to see some of the same explosion capabilities in this kind of technology.
Well, we do have more questions, so let me see if we were getting questions all along, and I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time for our presenters. So I'm going to go back to the questions that we had previously. So for Andrew, do you have thoughts about how regulatory accounting could treat something like shared communication networks across multiple utility types? And the author of this did say it might not be a fair question, but they were going to ask you anyway.
All right, well, I'll take a stab at it for sure. And, Jonathan had raised some pretty good points along those lines that, if there is a shared component like that, there will typically be a value or a dollar transaction right between the two entities to support that. But, I would argue utilities are already doing that today in the form of the way they treat their utility poles and sharing space on those poles. So I know a lot of times, at least for me, when I was working for a utility, we would have agreements, pole attachment agreements with other entities, where if we own the pole, they were paying us to be on that pole. If they own the pole, we were doing the same thing to them. So there might be something similar along those lines that could be followed, at least from a structural framework perspective, that could make it fairly straightforward based on, the number of endpoints maybe that are attaching, or other statistics that kind of keep it in a unit type format.
And I know the question was for Andrew, but if anyone else wanted to chime in on that question, please do.
Well, there are some, I think, very relevant examples in the fiber networks that utilities have that, basically apportion part of the dark fiber to, other users, and there are revenue share mechanisms. For example, in California, the private fiber networks that some of the utilities have, there's a revenue share between shareholders and ratepayers that exists and has existed for a long time on those networks. And certainly those models aren't just in California, they're elsewhere as well. And those are pretty analogous to what we're talking about here, it seems to me.
Okay, great. So we do have another question. So this one deals with every time I click my clicker, it goes another place. So are there specific generation technologies that would accelerate the need / benefits of having more robust advanced communication systems, such as distributed solar, offshore wind, utility-owned storage, the EV fleet, etc.? I don't know who the appropriate person would be, but I know
Yeah,
maybe Wendell could, jump in
yeah.
first.
I'll jump in, and there's kind of two ways, to answer that, and I think they're consistent. One is from the customer perspective. The more information, we can provide our customers about what's happening, at their site and what their electric capabilities, and particularly in a retail, environment or a commercial. First of all, to make sure that we're providing as consistent, reliable energy as we can to them, and the alternatives for doing that, but also letting them know when there's a glitch in the system, right? And a lot of them, are moving more towards batteries and solar recharging. And the more we can automate that and have it understand what's happening on the grid, the better. The second part of that is from a utility perspective. And we mentioned, peer-to-peer communications, particularly out on a feeder or out in that, tied to a substation. The more we can see when, certain parts of that feeder might be getting low on voltage or might be getting high on voltage, and we can shed that power and we can reduce our generation. So, all of that requires, a rather robust communication capability that is really localized, and intelligent in how it does that. I think it benefits both the customer as well as the utility.
Yeah, I might add, Wendell pointed this out earlier in his presentation, but in addition to the information, one of the things, that sort of drives the need to think differently about what communication and how you architect it is the latency that Wendell talked about. And one of the things we see with, say, increasing distributed resources and managing voltage is the time it takes to, the time periods at which you're trying to respond to changes in voltage that get out of standard that could impact the power quality of customers. And so, where peer-to-peer comes into play is being able to respond fast enough, and you need the communication system to be able to support that, as opposed to having information, as I think Jonathan showed, where you may send it all the way to the back office and then back out in terms of a control signal, say under a SCADA system, to then react, takes too long. So that latency, or the time that the round trip time for it to respond, is a driving factor. The other thing we're seeing in reliability and resilience is protection that may be required. Say if you're in an area with fire risk and you're looking at advanced protection that can reduce the ignition risk of a wire that might otherwise, start a fire, or a tree gets into, the line. The ability to have that respond fast and be able to, then interact with the switch, the intelligent switch, or even a breaker back at the substation, is driving a lot of the speed as well. And then the other is, as we think about DR integration, not just voltage, but the other factor that often comes into play, especially as you get greater and greater amounts of distributed resource, particularly rooftop solar, is protection. That becomes a limiting factor in the hosting capacity. And there we're talking about potentially changing from impedance type relays to maybe more differential type relays. And there that drives, that's a communication based technology. So there's things there that we're seeing on the horizon, in some places already starting, that will drive these kind of more advanced needs for different types of communication.
Thank you. We have another question in our Q&A section, And we also have a follow-up from our NARUC staff. But the question from John Woodward is, what are the panelists' perspectives on the extent to which next-gen AMI and smart inverters can substitute for more traditional sensing and control equipment? And that's for anyone.
Yeah, oh, this is Wendell from Excel. You know, I'll give you the utility perspective. I think anytime, I would say rather than the word substitute, I'd say enhance. The meter to us is not just something that, you know, allows us to do meter to cash. It's also a sense on the network that tells us what's the voltage, you know, what are the circuits, you know, happening there, and do they have power? And it gives us a chance, you know, to actually converse with a customer who says, hey, I lost my power, and we can do a blue sky read. And if we can read it, then we know that they have power, and we can help them find the problem. But the other thing is, you know, just having, as I mentioned earlier, the devices talking out there and seeing what's happening on the network, and having our advanced distribution management system reading those and understanding what is probably happening allows us to react quicker to either, you know, prevent an outage from occurring, or, you know, react quicker when an outage does occur. So it really just gives us, you know, much better insight into each of our customers and into each of our feeders that are happening out there to make sure we provide even greater reliability than we do, you know, today.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Wendell said is that it's important to, when we think about advanced inverters, and particularly those that are, say, rooftop or behind the meter resources, unlike what Wendell showed in the diagram, those are typically not directly connected to the utility's communication network. If there's a communication link, which often there is, it's through the house or commercial premises Wi-Fi to internet connection. And the link to the utility system might be through a back-end arrangement that Wendell showed. But only the larger systems that would be of the type that Wendell described may be directly connected, but the bulk of them that would be, you know, part of, you know, thinking about how you manage voltage, power quality on the system are not directly communicating. So one of the things is we do need to think about what they can contribute, but, you know, there is where the advanced meter provides that edge sensor to kind of show what's happening at that edge, in addition to sensors that are incorporated into the feeder itself and at the substation to see what's happening along the feeder along the way. So it's part of an integrated whole, as we might think about it.
If I could just add, I think these decisions are often a part of a long-term evolutionary process. You rarely have a utility that is a blank slate without a legacy system or without a prior grid modernizing set of investments that have come before. And so I think commissions need to both continue to authorize some of the ongoing investments in the kinds of technologies that are going to have 10 and 20-year lifespans, and at the same time take cognizance of the potential for longer term investments that will involve beyond pilots, but the kinds of technologies that will be able to evolve over time. I think what we want to avoid is a situation where we're ordering the steak and the lobster at the same time and having to pay for both.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that real quick. There's definitely a cost component to what we're talking about, right? And but you also have to look at what's at stake, right? So for a utility having, you know, what I'll call a utility grade communication system, incredibly important, because there's a lot on the line if that system fails, or if there's outages or wildfires or things that, you know, they need to mitigate. I think having additional data is always beneficial, and it can be, but you have to determine, you know, how much reliance can you put on that data to be there at your fingertips when you need it to make a critical business or potentially safety decision.
So I have two very similar questions. I'm trying to condense these two, and it's really about looking at the complexity of all this that's being discussed from the viewpoint of a regulator, and trying to determine the the traditional valuation of something that's being asked of us to cost recovery for cost recovery purposes. So I'd like to throw it out to any of you, like what would commissioners look at in terms of what type of metrics to be used when we're seeing something coming before us for consideration for cost recovery?
Well, one of the things that as part of the DOE work on the DSPX that I mentioned, one of the things we think is really important is being able to understand at the outset and identify what the objectives and therefore what are the capabilities that you're trying to accomplish. I mean, Jonathan talked about a number of these, Wendell as well, and Andrew. And it's really important that, those are identified early on, because ultimately what is proposed for funding needs to be able to support those objectives. But those objectives, obviously would be, it benefits from, commission, review and stakeholder input, and really close alignment with a long-term distribution plan or, larger, system plan that shows that, because of this, therefore that, is what's required, and that traceability from say long-term plans to objectives to what is required in terms of the investment is really critical, and that's a foundation that we think is important to be able to to explain if this is what we think is going to evolve over a 10-year horizon as part of a long-term plan in terms of DER adoption and electrification, how you want to manage charging, manage, the changes on the system and uses of the system, the uses of distributed resources for various purposes. All those things go into the calculus, the resilience and reliability plans. All of that goes into, providing the functional requirements for a telecommunication system, as we've been discussing, which allows you to have more clarity as to why what's being proposed meets this or doesn't meet it, and being able to have a pretty clear discussion about that.
I definitely agree with Paul's approach on having the 5-year to 10-year plan and time horizon. And I do think that's something that utilities should be sharing with their commission, because what does get difficult, and I think what the question's hitting on, is communications in general, it's usually overlaid across many programs. So it's hard to say, hey, here's how you're going to get your cost recovery by just an AMI solution or just advanced distribution management system package, right? And the rate at which those telecom systems may change out may need to be at a different time scale than what, say, a meter is. So, having that conversation with the commission to say, here's what our long-term objectives are, here's the plan, and then here's how it either enhances or overlays with these different applications, I think is important for them to understand. That's really the only way they can legitimately justify or make a decision on it. If they can't see always the direct line of sight to each individual program.
If I may, commissions are also dealing with an enormous asymmetry of information. There are lawyers and accountants and engineers at commissions, but most of those engineers are gas or electrical engineers. There are not as many, in my experience, there are not as many telecommunications systems engineers or system engineers at, working at commissions. So it's hard to have the personnel to ask the right questions. So one needs to ask more general questions. And that is still a good regulatory approach, to force a utility to provide what is your telecommunications strategy over the next 5 or 10 years. Please describe for us how you see your telecommunications investments evolving in line with your distribution system investments across all of your areas. And they may not have a document on the shelf. It may take them 3 months to develop something, but you can then have a technical conference and an ongoing conversation. Having the first time the conversation occurs, to have that happen within a docketed proceeding whether it's a rate case or a capital investment proceeding, which is relatively contentious, where everyone has their hackles up, where the attorney general is involved, that is not the time to build fundamental knowledge by staff or commissions. Doing it outside of those proceedings in a more generic technical conference context, I think can prove better results.
Yeah, and I totally agree with everything you said. And I'll add one more category of people that are important to the process, and that's the interveners. You know, they can ask some pretty challenging questions as well, which is great. And having experienced a lot of that, you know, and having gone through it in one fashion with one of our states and a different one with another, you know, one of them did what we called an IDP and asked us to, you know, implement, you know, our distribution plan, which included our, you know, we included our network strategy within there. And it's not always perfect, right? And I think it's important that utilities are comfortable saying, hey, we don't have the perfect answers here, but here's where we're going. Here's what we do know. Here's the factors that will come into play as we make those decisions. It creates a conversation with the commissioners and the staff and you know, anybody else who wants to intervene in there to at least give, you know, some transparency to where we're going and what we're doing and why we're making the decisions we do. And, you know, the one thing I'll add there is I think there's a tendency to do a lot of writers here recently. And I think the commissions are getting writer fatigue. So now how do we incorporate that back into our, you know, base rate cases? And because telecom is now becoming a very significant cost factor. So
I just the information that you all four were able to give in your answers shows how complex this area is. So I do thank you for that. I think we have time for one or two possibly questions, but I do have another one in the Q&A. This one specifically for Wendell. It says, Wendell, could you speak to how Xcel Energy is thinking about sharing the communication network and advanced meter infrastructure between gas and electric services or other utilities? Kind of what we may have talked about earlier, but I am going to throw that question at you.
yeah, no, it's a very good point. And yeah, I'll start with the, you know, how do we share it between electric and gas? And I'll say even the other parts of our businesses, whether it be transmission or generation, you know, having a consistent mapping and like the technology we use, like I mentioned, particularly the mesh, you know, moving towards private LTE, but also having public cellular and fiber as options. We use those same standards as we go into areas. So, you know, I would say about 60% or 70% of our electric areas are also included in electric. And so I mentioned earlier, once we put the mesh out there and cover our electric areas, adding gas meters and gas sensors to those networks is very low cost. You know, it's more the back end side we just need to work on. So they're part of our strategy. It's, you know, we mentioned a 3 to 5 year strategy. They're there. For non-gas areas, you know, we'll be looking at different, maybe it's cellular takeout, maybe it's, you know, other ways, but still using the same technology we use. And in that way, we do want to share our networks. The other aspect I think is that we're getting is, you know, sharing it with folks outside. And I'll just say that we've had quite a few conversations more at the municipality, city level or county level that, you know, show some opportunities to either share our network capabilities, whether it be fiber, you know, giving them some strands to help, or even using some of the mesh to read water meters. We're not very far along in that because we kind of want to get our, you know, feet on the ground first. But the conversations like that are already starting, and then we get more into what I would call a sharing situation. We don't, you know, really look at it as a revenue generator. You know, in some cases it might be, but that's really not our goal. Is to serve our communities and the customers that we have there.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have run out of time. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank all of you for participating. And I know that our audience has been educated on this issue and probably still has a lot more questions they would like to ask you. This is something that probably could go on for another hour or two easily. But we just want to thank you for your participation here today. We also want to thank those in attendance for this webinar. We want to thank NARUC Center for Partnership and Innovation for setting up the panel. A special thanks to Carrie Worthington, our Senior Manager for CPI. Also want to remind everyone that the next Regulators Financial Toolbox webinar will focus on resilience technologies, and that will be held on August 25th, 2021 at 3 p.m. Once again, thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you very much.